Administration and Finance of the East India Company by Babasaheb Ambedkar. Part 5. India and the Act of 1858. The East India Company, in spite of the fact that she was a source of great prosperity in England, suffered great humiliation at the hands of the British Parliament and people. The East India Company was jealous of her monopoly of the Indian trade and British were determined to derive as large a gain as possible for allowing her that privilege. Every weakness in the administration was made an excuse for extortion and interference, and renewal of charter was often an occasion to disgorge her of a wealth accumulated by the monopoly of Indian trade. Very early in the history of the company, a controversy as to this monopoly of trade had arisen, and pros and cons were acrimoniously discussed. Up to 1833, the company, by means fair and foul, managed to win over the English statesmen to continue her monopoly. But in that year, the cry against her monopoly had grown so loud that both the company and the ministers had to give in, and the East India Company was thrown open to the English public. By the Act of 1834, the company ceased to be a commercial corporation. How the obligations of the company were met may be seen from the following. The tangible commercial property sold under the Act of 1834 realized 14 million, which was thus deposited of 8 million towards the discharges of Indian debt, 2 million was applied to payment of territorial charges in England, 1 million was applied to liquidation of part of the home bond debt, 2 million was paid into the Bank of England for investment in the funds to provide a security fund at compound interest, while the ultimatum redemption of the capital stock of the company, 6 million, in 1874. 500,000 was applied to compensations to ship owners and other persons, and the remainder of 500,000 was retained in England as an available cash balance for the purposes of government in India. The unavailable assets claimed as commercial by the company, that is, the Indian House in Leadenhall Street, one warehouse retained for a military store department, and a house property in India, the whole valued at 600,000, remained in the hands of the company but applicable to the uses of the Indian government. Though as a trading body the company disappeared, it continued its existence as a political sovereign of her territories in India. Unfortunately for the company, her days were fast being numbered. It is an error to suppose that the East India Company was abolished because of her inefficiency as manifested in the Mutiny of 1857. On the contrary, before the mutiny had actually taken place, the discussion about the direct assumption of the government of India by the Crown was set afloat, which is indicative of the fact that the mutiny or no mutiny, the British statesmen were impatient to have direct control over the leaves and the fishes that came out indirectly from their rule in India by a process of disgorging a corporation which directly fed them on beef fat. This roundabout process was tiresome and mentally exhausting for impatient minds. Lord Palmerston, having been returned by a strong majority in 1857 as a result of his success in the Crimean War, immediately notified the directors of the company, to their great surprise, that he proposed to introduce a bill for the abolition of the company and the resumption of the direct government of India by the Crown. Unfortunately, the mutiny did occur in 1857 and gave a strong impetus to the abolition movement already in full swing. On the 31st day of December 1857, the chairman and the deputy chairman of the company replied to the notification of Palmerston, urging that an intermediate, non-political and perfectly independent body similar to the company was a necessity for the administration of India. Besides this, the company sent a formal petition to both houses of Parliament. John Stuart Mill, who drafted the petition, showed the fallacy in the arguments of the mover of the bill for the abolition of the company. From the very beginning, the Crown had exercised its control over the Indian government through its minister presiding over the Board of Control. Between the government of India and the Crown Minister, there was the Court of Directors, which the new bill wanted to do away with. Mill argued that this Court of Directors, the organ of the East India Company, the embodiment of experience, was a good guide for the Crown Minister who really controlled the entire administration of India, and said that if evils have really risen from the mode of administration, the remedy that was sought, that is, of doing away with the Court of Directors and thus making the Crown Minister an autocrat, was worse than the disease. To believe that the administration of India would have been more from error had it been conducted by a minister of the Crown without the aid of the court of directors, would be to believe that the minister with full powers to govern India as he pleased has governed ill, because he has the assistance of experienced and responsible advisers. A diversity of opinion prevailed as to the future connection of India with England. The Stanley Review, an important newspaper in England, argued that the East India Company be maintained to keep away India from English politics. It made quite a point of the fact that Englishmen who went over to India became autocrats, and that in it there was a danger to democracy. It boldly proclaimed that India, like a colossal torpedo, will paralyze the beneficent activities and benumb the free moral life of England, and if brought full in sight of England, will serve her as a great school, in which she learn the principles of the King of Naples and the practice of Mrs. Stowe's Legree. Others, notably a certain Richard Congreve, a disciple of Comte, pleaded that India should be left to work out her own destiny. He maintained that the rule of one people by another is demoralizing and not wise for the better development of humanity. In order to prevent any other nation from stepping into India after the English had left, he promised that an international board be appointed to regulate the administration, which was ultimately to devolve upon the Indians when they became capable of self-government. None of these views, however, fall in with those of the British parliamentaries who decided differently. They were determined to abolish the East India Company and take the government of India immediately under the ground. They desired to substitute direct government for the double government. As a result of this, neither the petition nor the independent public opinion proved of any effect, and Palmerston introduced his bill for the abolition of the company and the future government of India. Before the bill was passed, the Conspiracy Bill threw out the government of Palmerston, which was succeeded by a Conservative one under the leadership of Lord Derby. After Lord Palmerston's bill had gone out by his overthrow, Benjamin Disraeli, the Chancellor under Lord Derby, introduced his India Bill. John Stuart Mill's comparison of the merits of the two bills is very instructing, and later events have borne out his contentions. He says, "The means which the bills provide for overcoming these difficulties of the government of one nation by another consist of the unchecked power of a minister. There is no difference of moment in this respect between the two bills. The minister, it is true, it is to have a council, but the most despotic rulers have councils. The difference between the council of a despot and a council which prevents the ruler from being a despot is that the one is dependent on him, the other independent, that the one has some power of its own, the other has not. By the first bill, Lord Palmerston's bill, the whole council is nominated by the minister. By the second, Disraeli's bill, one half of it is nominated by him. The functions entrusted to it are left in both, with some slight exceptions, to the minister's own discretion. Disraeli's bill suffered worse fate than the one of Lord Palmerston. It simply fell. A new bill was therefore introduced in August 1858 and passed, designated as an Act for the Better Government of India. The provision of this Act, of Section 75, which still largely regulated the administration of India, may be divided into two classes according to their nature. One, those dealing with past affairs, and two, those dealing with future affairs. We will first consider those which deal with past affairs, mainly the settlement of the fiscal and commercial obligations of the company. Section 42 of this Act provided that the dividend on the capital stock of the East India Company should be charged and chargeable upon the revenues of India alone. Amidst all the questions between India and England that had to be settled with equity, none was more prominent than the question of the Indian debt. Who should bear the burden of the Indian debt? Who the burning question of the time? The crux of the question was who was responsible for it and what was its purpose. The most enlightening commentary on the problem is that of Major Wingate, who immediately after the mutiny argued that the people of India had a voice in the management of their affairs, and have the regulation and taxation and expenditure of the Indian government been regulated with a view to the welfare of India alone, without intervention or interference on the part of the government of this country. By no means the government of India, whether viewed with reference to its forms or powers, has been, from the first hour of its existence up to the present time, the creation of the British Parliament. The power vested in the government of India to contract debt, with a delegation of authority from the British Parliament, which up to this hour, as in the case of the last debenture loan, exerts the right of interference over its exercise, the East India Company has been declared by Parliament to have been simply trustees for the British nation, which, in accordance with this view, altered the conditions of their trust from time to time, and finally relieved the trustees of its exercise altogether. When the subject is carefully examined, it will be found that the Government of India, so far from being a government of this distinct state, has been from the first simply a department of the British government. The British Ministry, acting through the President of the Board of Control, formed the real motive power which decided the policy of successive Indian administrations, and the East India Company was simply a convenient screen. If the facts be so, then, and they cannot be gainsaid, we seem to be shut up to the conclusion that the acts of the Government of India, from first to last, have been the acts of the British nation. India has never had even the shadow of a constitution or of a national government, but has been ruled as a conquered country according to the views of the successive British parliaments and the British administrations. The Indian debt has really been incurred by the government of this country, and how then can we possibly shake ourselves free of the Indian liabilities? Mr. Wingett also appealed to the humane part of the British public by dwelling upon the advantages to England and the injuries to India. In proceeding to consider these advantages, there is one most important fact which should ever be present to the mind of the reader, and that is, that those advantages, be they great or small, have cost the nation nothing to acquire. This may sound as a startling assertion in the eyes of an Englishman of this generation, who have not yet forgotten the heavy bills which they have had to pay for Canada rebellions, Caffrey wars, Ceylon insurrections, and many manumissions of West Indians. Slaves, and who are annually reminded of the cost of governing or protecting our colonies or dependencies by the financial estimates submitted to Parliament, but the assertion, nevertheless, is strictly and liberally correct. Strange, may we wonderingly exclaim, that we who have spent so much on our colonial possessions and have waged so many costly wars for thankless foreigners, should have laid out no money in the acquisition or improvement of our great Indian empire. The thing cannot be, it is too astounding for belief. Astounding indeed it is, but there is something still more astonishing behind, for not only is it a fact that India has not been acquired without the expenditure of a single shilling on the part of this country, but it is equally a fact that so far from involving outlay, India has regularly paid to Great Britain a heavy tribute, which, there is reason for thinking, has not fallen far short of the almost incredible sum of 100 million sterling in the course of the present century. The Indian tribute, whether weighed in the scales of justice or viewed in the light of our own true interest, be found to be at variance with humanity, with common sense, and with the received maxims of economical science. Touching the grievances of India, Mr. Wingett asked the English public, has our policy in India been determined out of pure, unselfish, and benevolent regard for the welfare of the people of that country, and without the smallest regard for the manner in which it may affect our own way? Was this the principle which guided us in imposing prohibitive duties upon Indian manufacturers imported into this country, and merely nominal duties upon British manufacturers imported into India? Was it out of pure regard for India that cotton exported to Great Britain from India is exempt from duty, while it is taxed on exportation to all parts of the world besides? Was it Indian interest which dictated the fixing of import duties upon goods brought to India in British ships at one half of the amount levied upon similar goods brought in ships to any other country? Were native interests solely concerned with the exemption of Europeans in India from the jurisdiction of the ordinary courts of criminal justice, by which native redress for a British wrongdoing has been made a practical impossibility in 99 cases out of 100? Was it out of consideration for the tax-paying Hindu and Mohammedan that the official European in India was provided with a costly ecclesiastical establishment before anything else was done for their education or enlightenment? Was it unselfish regard for the natives that dictated the policy of obtaining, upholding, and extending British dominion in the East by means of taxes raised in India, in opposition to the rule obtained in all other British dependencies of providing for the costs of their military defence from the British exchequer? And lastly, for the arrangements for defraying what is styled the home charges out of the Indian revenues, under which barely 100 million sterling of taxes collected in India have been transferred to Great Britain in the course of the present century, devised for the purpose of benefiting the people of India alone. Let the candid reader thoughtfully and conscientiously answer these questions for himself, and then say why the British interest as well as Indian interests have not had a share in determining the course of our Indian policy. All the arguments, legal and humanitarian, failed to win the day. The English Parliament flatly refused to share in the Indian debt which created the acquisition of the empire. The entire heavy load of the debt of the East India Company, amounting to 69 million, mostly unproductive, was placed on the shoulders of the poverty-stricken native who had no voice in the doings of the company. This was not all. The unfortunate mutiny cost 40 million, and as a legitimate expenditure for the acquisition of an empire, England in justice ought to have paid the cost of the mutiny. John Bright, who often exposed the cause of the Indian taxpayers, appealed to the Parliament, saying that the 40 million which they revolt will cost is a grievous burden to place upon the people of India. It has come from the mismanagement of the Parliament and the people of England. If every man had what was just, no doubt but 40 million would have to be paid out of the taxes levied upon the people of this country, England. The practical outcome of these unjust arrangements was that the people of India purchased the empire at many millions, for the debt was only a part of the cost, and made an offering of it to the British Crown. In other words, the empire was either a gift or a trust. The arrangements regarding the stock of the East India Company are in the same iniquitous vein. The stock of the company was redeemed by a loan which was also added to the already enormous debt, consolidated into what was known as the Indian government debt. What the act really did was to annihilate the Board of Control. The company, through legal extinct, continues to live for all practical purposes and enjoys her dividends even to this day in the shape of interest paid out of Indian revenues. The astounding result of this policy was gains to England and costs to India. When every effort was at giving justice to India failed in the British Parliament, Lord Derby moved this enormous debt of India be guaranteed by the Parliament, so that on the security of it the interest rate be lowered and the Indian taxpayer be relieved. He said, I am aware that the uniform policy of Parliament and the government of this country has been to decline all responsibility in regard to the debt of India, which has been held to be a charge only on the Indian exchequer. Dealing with the present state of affairs, I may say at once, I am not going to recommend any change in that policy. I know well the alarm which any such proposition would create, and I know the refusal which it would inevitably receive. But this is a question which will recur again and again, and which will have to be considered in the future as well as in the present. I would likewise ask the House to bear in mind that if ever the time should come when the established policy in this respect should undergo a change, and when a national guarantee should be given for those liabilities, that guarantee would operate to reduce the interest paid upon the Indian debt by no less than 750,000 or even a million, which, formed into a sinking fund, would go far to pay off the whole. John Bright, who through sheer short-sightedness opposed, said, I object to an imperial guarantee on this ground if we left the services of India, after exhausting the resources of India, put their hands into the pockets of the English people. The people of England having no control over Indian expenditure, it is impossible to say what lengths of unimagined extravagance they would not go, and in endeavouring to save India, may we not go far towards ruining England? Not only was there no warrant for Mr. Bright to magnify this danger so much, but he failed to see that the people of England would have very soon ceased to neglect the affairs of India, and would have obtained a real control over Indian expenditure if some share of the liability of the Indian debt had been thrown on them. The discussions were all abortive and did not even recompense the breath that was wasted, and in no sense did the natives get any relief from the direful spring of woes unnumbered. Let us now see what the Act willed for the future. Section 55 said, excepting for preventing or repelling actual invasion of Her Majesty's Indian possessions, or under other sudden and urgent necessities, the revenues of India shall not, without the consent of the both Houses of Parliament, be applicable to defray the expenses of any military operation carried on beyond the external frontiers of such possessions by Her Majesty's forces charged upon such revenues. With profound respect for the intellect of Mr. R.C. Dutt, one, however, cannot understand on what ground does he characterize this section as one salutary financial proposition. That it was an improvement over the financial administration of the East India Company, no one can doubt. But it is by no means salutary in that the revenues of India have been spent outside India for non-Indian purposes even after the Act. The fatal error lay in this. The excepting clause in the above section, which sanctions the expenditure of Indian revenue outside of India, omits the vital word previous. The clause, in order to be salutary in effect, ought to run: the revenues of India shall not, without the previous consent of both Houses of Parliament, be applicable, etc. And not in the way it does. An unknown writer says, in all probability, that essential proviso was comprised in the original draft, but afterwards eliminated by the same mischievous hand which contrived in sections 26, 27, and 28 to secure the entire immunity, irresponsibility, and personal autocracy of the Secretary of State. After showing that Lord Stanley and the Earl of Derby, who had so much to do with the framing of the statute, were united in the including of the neglected proviso, the writer quotes the opinion of Mr. Gladstone regarding section 55 as follows. In my view, it was the purpose of this clause to require the parliamentary consent of Parliament to the issue of Indian money for the purposes of operation carried on by the forces charged upon India beyond the Indian frontier, except in certain special cases, which were very carefully defined. It was, in fact, to prevent the use of Indian money for military operations. I remember this, for I myself was the author of the clause, and the present Lord Derby, who was Secretary of State for India at the time, concurred with me as to its object. The same writer goes on to say, there are few, if any, causes that have brought more disaster and financial damage to India of the Queen than has the utter disregard of the safeguards ostensibly ordained under these despised and neglected provisions of the Act. We are well aware that even had the word previous been included in the section, the clamour on behalf of pseudo-imperial interests or the exigencies of party schemes might have sufficed to override the claims and rights of the Indian people. But that word would at least have secured an invaluable respite, during which the voice of reason might have been heard. The non-fiscal sections of this Act were 1. The territories of the East India Company were vested in Her Majesty the Queen, and the powers exercised by the East India Company and the Board of Control were vested in the Secretary of State for India. He was to have a council of 15 members who would hold office during good behaviour, and each member was to have a salary of £1,200 a year out of the revenues of India. The pay of the Secretary of State and all his establishment would similarly be charged to India. 2. The Secretary of State was empowered to act against the majority of the Council except in certain specified matters, and on questions of peace and war which had hitherto been dealt with by the Board of Control through the secret committee of the Court of Directors, the Secretary of State was empowered to send orders to India without consulting his council or communicating them to the members. 3. The Governor-General of India and the Governors of Madras and Bombay would henceforth be appointed by Her Majesty the Queen, and the appointments of Lieutenant Governors would be made by the Governor-General subject to the approbation of Her Majesty. Rules should be framed by the Secretary of State for administration into the civil service of India by competition. The evil tendencies of these administrators and above referred to have been attested to be 1. Autocracy, 2. Secrecy, and 3. Irresponsibility, all of which are inimical to the good demonstration and administration of the country. It is lamentable that the Act made no provision for enlisting the voice of the natives in the administration of their own country. In this vital respect, can anyone say that the administration of the company differed very much from the administration of the Crown? In order to give publicity to the provisions of this Act, Queen Victoria asked Lord Derby, apparently not being satisfied with the first draft of it, to issue a proclamation which, as she said, should breed feelings of generosity, benevolence, and religious toleration, and point out the privileges which the Indians will receive in being placed on an equality with the subjects of the British Crown, and the prosperity following in the train of civilization. This proclamation was rega in India and has been regarded as the Magna Carta of India, and not the Magna Carta contained the rights of people, but it was a great document. It remains, however, to estimate the contribution of England to India. Apparently, the immenseness of India's contribution to England is as much astounding to the nothingness of England's contribution to India. Both are, however, true statements if looked at from economical points of view. But from another point of view, if India's tribute cannot be weighed in the scale of justice and humanity, then England's contribution cannot be weighed in the scale of gold and silver. The last statement is both literally as well as figuratively true. England has added nothing to the stock of gold and silver in India. On the contrary, she has depleted India, the sink of the world. The contribution lies in the uneconomical realm, but just the same, it is too great to be measured in terms of coin. Englishmen can look back on their work in India, if not with unalloyed satisfaction, at least with some legitimate pride. They have conferred on the people of India what is the greatest human blessing, peace. They have introduced Western education, bringing an ancient civilized nation in touch with modern institutions and life. They have built up an administration which, through its requires reform with the progress of the times, is yet strong and efficacious. They have framed wise laws and have established courts of justice and purity, of which is as absolute as in any country on the face of the earth. There are results which honest critic of British work in India regards without high admiration. But whether mere animal peace is to be preferred to economic destitution, let everyone decide for himself. The end.